The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester. This book consists of 11 chapters and a postscript, and is 237 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Mysterious. Adjective, from Latin mysterium, mystery, plus aus. See French mystérieux. Full of or fraught with mystery, wrapped in mystery, hidden from human knowledge or understanding, impossible or difficult to explain, solve, or discover, of obscure origin, nature, or purpose. It is known as one of the greatest literary achievements in the history of English letters. The creation of the Oxford English Dictionary began in 1857, took 70 years to complete, drew from tens of thousands of brilliant minds, and organized the sprawling language into 414,825 precise definitions. But hidden within the rituals of its creation is a fascinating and mysterious story. A story of two remarkable men whose strange 20-year relationship lies at the core of this historic undertaking. Professor James Murray, an astonishingly learned former schoolmaster and bank clerk, was the distinguished editor of the OED project. Dr. William Chester Minor, an American surgeon from New Haven, Connecticut, who had served in the Civil War, was one of thousands of contributors who submitted illustrative quotations of words to be used in the dictionary. But Minor was no ordinary contributor. He was remarkably prolific, sending thousands of neat, handwritten quotations from his home in the small village of Crowthorne, 50 miles from Oxford. On numerous occasions, Murray invited Minor to visit Oxford and celebrate his work, but Murray's offer was regularly and mysteriously refused. Thus the two men for 2 decades maintained a close relationship only through correspondence. Finally, in 1896, after Minor had sent nearly 10,000 definitions to the dictionary, but had still never travelled from his home, a puzzled Murray set out to visit him. It was then that Murray finally learned the truth about Minor, that, in addition to being a masterful wordsmith, Minor was also a murderer, clinically insane, and locked up in Broadmoor, England's harshest asylum for criminal lunatics. The Professor and the Madman is an extraordinary tale of madness and genius, and the incredible obsessions of two men at the heart of the Oxford English Dictionary and literary history. With riveting insight and detail, Simon Winchester crafts a fascinating glimpse into one man's tortured mind and his contribution to another man's magnificent dictionary. Simon Winchester is a writer and adventurer who has written for Condé Nast Traveller, Smithsonian, and National Geographic, and has had an award-winning 30-year newspaper career. His books include The River at the Centre of the World, The Sun Never Sets, Career, A Walk Through the Land of Miracles, Pacific Rising, Pacific Nightmare, and Prison Diary, Argentina. He lives in New York and London. The book bears a dedication to the memory of G.M. and is followed by a preface. Mysterious. Adjective, from Latin mysterium, mystery, plus aus. Compare French mystérieux. 1. Full of or fraught with mystery, wrapped in mystery, hidden from human knowledge or understanding, impossible or difficult to explain, solve, or discover, of obscure origin, nature, or purpose. Popular myth has it that one of the most remarkable conversations in modern literary history took place on a cool and misty late autumn afternoon in 1896 in the small village of Crowthorne in the county of Berkshire. One of the parties to the colloquy was the formidable Dr. James Murray, the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. On the day in question, he had travelled 50 miles by train from Oxford to meet an enigmatic figure named Dr. W.C. Minor, who was among the most prolific of the thousands of volunteer contributors whose labours lay at the core of the dictionary's creation. For very nearly 20 years beforehand, these two men had corresponded regularly about the finer points of English lexicography, but they'd never met. Dr. Minor seemed never willing or able to leave his home at Crowthorne, never willing to come to Oxford. He was unable to offer any kind of explanation, or to do more than offer his regrets. Dr. Murray, who himself was rarely free from the burdens of his work at his dictionary headquarters, the famous scriptorium in Oxford, had none the less long dearly wished to see and thank his mysterious and intriguing helper, and particularly so by the late 1890s, with the dictionary well on its way to being half completed. Official honours were being showered upon all its creators, and Murray wanted to make sure that all those involved, even men so apparently bashful as Dr. Minor, were recognized for the valuable work they had done. He decided he would pay a visit. Once he'd made up his mind to go, he telegraphed his intentions, adding that he would find it most convenient to take a train that arrived at Crowthorne Station, then actually known as Wellington College Station, since it served the famous boys' school situated in the village, just after 2 on a certain Wednesday in November. Dr. Minor sent a wire by return to say that he was indeed expected and would be made most welcome. On the journey from Oxford the weather was fine, the trains were on time, the auguries, in short, were good. At the railway station a polished landau and a liveried coachman were waiting, and with James Murray aboard they clip-clopped back through the lanes of rural Berkshire. After 20 minutes or so the carriage turned up a long drive, lined with tall poplars, drawing up eventually outside a huge and rather forbidding red-brick mansion. A solemn servant showed the lexicographer upstairs and into a book-lined study, where behind an immense mahogany desk stood a man of undoubted importance. Dr. Murray bowed gravely and launched into the brief speech of greeting that he had so long rehearsed. "A very good afternoon to you, sir. I'm Dr. James Murray of the London Philological Society, and editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. It is indeed an honour and a pleasure to at long last make your acquaintance. For you must be, kind sir, my most assiduous helpmeet, Dr. W.C. Minor." There was a brief pause, a momentary air of mutual embarrassment. A clock ticked loudly. There were muffled footsteps in the hall, a distant clank of keys. And then the man behind the desk cleared his throat, and he spoke. "I regret, kind sir, that I'm not. It is not at all as you suppose. I am, in fact, the governor of the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Dr. Minor is most certainly here, but he is an inmate. He has been a patient here for more than 20 years. He is our longest-staying resident." Although the official government files relating to this case are secret and have been locked away for more than a century, I have recently been allowed to see them. What follows is the strange, tragic, yet spiritually uplifting story they reveal. The Professor and the Madman. Chapter 1. The Dead of Night in Lambeth Marsh. Murder. The word has not been found in any Teutonic language, but English and Gothic. But that it existed in continental West German is evident, as it is the source of Old French murdre, meurtre, modern French meurtre, and of medieval Latin mordrum, murdrum, and OHG had the derivative murdren, murder. See, all the Teutonic languages, except Gothic, possessed a synonymous word from the same root with different suffix. Old English, mord, neuter masculine, mirth. Old Saxon, mord, neuter. Old Frisian, morth, mord, neuter. Modern Dutch, mort, mord, neuter. Dutch, mord. OHG, mord. MHG, more. Modern German, mord. Old Norse, mord, neuter. Old Teutonic, morbo. Pre-Teutonic, murto. Change of original T into D contrary to the general tendency to change D into Th before syllabic R, was probably due to the influence of the antique French murdre, moidre, and the law Latin murdrum. 1. The most heinous kind of criminal homicide, also an instance of this. In English, also Scottish and US, law, defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Often more explicitly, willful murder. In Old English, the word could be applied to any homicide that was strongly reprobated. It had also the senses great wickedness, deadly injury, torment. More strictly, however, it denoted secret murder, which in Germanic antiquity was alone regarded as, in the modern sense, a crime, open homicide being considered a private wrong calling for blood revenge or compensation. Even under Edward I, Britain explains the antique French murdre only as felonious homicide of which both the perpetrator and the victim are unidentified. The malice aforethought, which enters into the legal definition of murder, does not, as now interpreted, admit of any summary definition. A person may even be guilty of willful murder without intending the death of the victim, as when death results from an unlawful act which the doer knew to be likely to cause the death of someone, or from injuries inflicted to facilitate the commission of certain offences. It is essential to murder that the perpetrator be of sound mind, and in England, though not in Scotland, that death should ensue within a year and a day after the act presumed to have caused it. In British law, no degrees of guilt are recognized in murder. In the United States, the law distinguishes murder in the first degree, where there are no mitigating circumstances, and murder in the second degree. In Victorian London, even in a place as louche and notoriously crime-ridden as Lambeth Marsh, the sound of gunshots was a rare event indeed. The Marsh was a sinister place, a jumble of slums and sin that crouched, dark and ogre-like, on the bank of the Thames just across from Westminster. Few respectable Londoners would ever admit to venturing there. It was a robustly violent part of town as well. The footpad lurked in Lambeth. There'd once been an outbreak of garrotting, and in every crowded alley were the roughest kinds of pickpocket. Fagin, Bill Sykes, and Oliver Twist would have all seemed quite at home in Victorian Lambeth. This was Dickensian London writ large. But it was not a place for men with guns. The armed criminal was a phenomenon little known in the Lambeth of Prime Minister Gladstone's day, and even less known in the entire metropolitan vastness of London. Guns were costly, cumbersome, difficult to use, hard to conceal. Then, as still today, the use of a firearm in the commission of a crime was thought of as somehow a very un-British act, and as something to be written about and recorded as a rarity. Happily, proclaimed a smug editorial in Lambeth's weekly newspaper, we in this country have no experience of the crime of shooting down, so common in the United States. So when a brief fusillade of 3 revolver shots rang out shortly after 2 o'clock on the moonlit Saturday morning of February the 17th, 1872, the sound was unimagined, unprecedented, and shocking. 3 cracks, perhaps there were 4, were loud, very loud, and they echoed through the cold and smokily damp night air. They were heard, and considering their rarity, just by chance instantly recognized, by a keen young police constable named Henry Tarrant, then attached to the Southwark Constabulary's L Division. The clocks had only recently struck 2, his notes said later. He was performing with routine languor the duties of the graveyard shift, walking slowly beneath the viaduct arches beside Waterloo railway station, rattling the locks of the shops and cursing the bone-numbing chill. When he heard the shots, Tarrant blew his whistle to alert any colleagues who, he hoped, might be on patrol nearby, and he began to run. Within seconds he had raced through the warren of mean and slippery lanes that made up what in those days was still called a village, and had emerged into the wide riverside swath of Belvedere Road, from whence he was certain the sounds had come. Another policeman, Henry Burton, who had heard the piercing whistle, as had a third, William Ward, rushed to the scene. According to Burton's notes, he dashed toward the echoing sound and came across his colleague Tarrant, who was by then holding a man as if arresting him. "Quick!" cried Tarrant. "Go to the road! A man has been shot!" Burton and Ward raced towards Belvedere Road, and within seconds found the unmoving body of a dying man. They fell to their knees, and onlookers noted they had cast off their helmets and gloves, and were hunched over the victim. There was blood gushing onto the pavement, blood staining a spot that would for many months afterwards be described in London's more dramatically minded papers as the location of a heinous crime, a terrible event, an atrocious occurrence, a vile murder. The Lambeth tragedy, the papers eventually settled upon calling it, as if the simple existence of Lambeth itself were not something of a tragedy. Yet this was a most unusual event, even by the diminished standards of the marsh dwellers. For though the place where the killing occurred had over the years been witness to many strange events, the kind eagerly chronicled in the Penny Dreadfuls, this particular drama was to trigger a chain of consequences that was quite without precedent. And while some aspects of this crime and its aftermath would turn out to be sad and barely believable, not all of them, as this account will show, were to be wholly tragic. Far from it, indeed. Even today, Lambeth is a singularly unlovely part of the British capital, jammed anonymously between the great fan of roads and railway lines that take commuters in and out of the city centre from the southern counties. These days the Royal Festival Hall and the South Bank Centre stand there, built on the site of the 1951 fairgrounds, where an entertainment was staged to help cheer up the rationed and threadbare Londoners. Otherwise, it is an unlovely, characterless sort of place. Rows of prison-like buildings that house lesser government ministries, the headquarters of an oil company around which winter winds whip bitterly, a few unmemorable pubs and newspaper shops, and the lowering presence of Waterloo Station, lately expanded with the terminal for the Channel Tunnel Express trains, which exerts its dull magnetic pull over the neighbourhood. The railway chiefs of old never bothered to build a grand station hotel at Waterloo, though they did build monster structures of great luxury at the other London stations, like Victoria and Paddington, and even St Pancras and King's Cross. Lambeth has long been one of the nastier parts of London, until very recently, with the further development of the Festival Hall site. No one of any style and consequence has ever wanted to linger there, neither a passenger back in the days of the Victorian boat trains, nor anyone for any reason at all today. It is slowly improving, but its reputation dogs it. 100 years ago it was positively vile. It was still then low, marshy, and undrained, a swampy gyre of pathways, where a sad little stream called the Neckinger seeped into the Thames. The land was jointly owned by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Duke of Cornwall, landlords who, rich enough in their own right, never bothered to develop it in the manner of the great lords of London, Grosvenor, Bedford, Devonshire, who created the squares, mansions, and terraces on the far side of the river. So it was instead a place of warehouses, tenant shacks, and miserable rows of ill-built houses. There were blacking factories, shoe-polish makers like the one in which the young Charles Dickens worked, and soap boilers, small firms of dyers and lime burners, and tanning yards where the leather workers used a substance for darkening skins that was known as pure, and that was gathered from the streets each night by the filthiest of the local indigents, pure being a Victorian term for dog turds. A sickly smell of yeast and hops lay over the town, wafting from the chimneys of the great Red Line brewery, which stood on Belvedere Road just north of the Hungerford Bridge. And this bridge was symbolic of what encompassed the entire marsh. The railways, hefted high over the swamps, on viaducts on which the trains, including those of the London Necropolis Railway, built to take corpses to the cemeteries in the suburb of Woking, chuffed and snorted, and across which miles of wagons lurched and banged. Lambeth was widely regarded as one of the noisiest and most sulphurous parts of a capital that had already a grim reputation for din and dirt. Lambeth Marsh was also, as it happened, just beyond the legal jurisdiction of both the cities of London and Westminster. It belonged administratively, at least until 1888, to the county of Surrey, meaning that the relatively strict laws that applied to the capital citizens did not apply to anyone who ventured via one of the new bridges, like Waterloo, Blackfriars, Westminster, or Hungerford, into the Wen of Lambeth. The village thus fast became known as a site of revelry and abandon, a place where public houses, brothels, and lewd theatres abounded, and where a man could find entertainment of all kinds, and disease of all varieties, for no more than a handful of pennies. To see a play that would not pass muster with the London censors, to be able to drink absinthe into the small hours of the morning, to buy the choicest pornography newly smuggled from Paris, or to have a girl of any age, and not be concerned that a Bow Street runner, as London's early police were known, or her parents might chase after you. You went Surrey side, as they said, to Lambeth. But, as with most slums, its cheapness attracted respectable men to live and work in Lambeth too, and by all accounts George Merritt was one of them. He was a stoker at the Red Lion Brewery. He had been there for the previous 8 years, employed all the time as one of the gang who kept the fires burning through the day and night, keeping the vats bubbling and the barley malting. He was 34 years old, and he lived locally at 24 Cornwall Cottages on the Cornwall Road. George Merritt was, like so many younger workers in Victorian London, an immigrant from the countryside, and so was his wife Eliza. He came from a village in Wiltshire, she from Gloucestershire. They'd both been farm labourers, and, with no protection by unions, no solidarity with their fellows, had been paid trifling sums to perform humiliating tasks for pitiless masters. They'd met at a farm show in the Cotswolds, and had vowed to leave together for the immeasurable possibilities offered by London, only 2 hours away on the new express train from Swindon. They moved first to North London, where their first daughter Claire was born in 1860. Then they shifted into the city centre, and finally in 1867, the family having become too large and costly, and manual work too scarce, they found themselves near the brewery site in the bustling sty of Lambeth. The young couple's surroundings and lodgings were exactly as the illustrator Gustave Doré had drawn on one of his horrified expeditions from Paris. A dim world of bricks and soot and screeching iron, of huddled tenements, of tiny backyards, each with a privy and clothes boiler and washing line, and everywhere an air of damp and sulphurous stench, and even a rough-hewn, rollicking, hugger-mugger, devil-may-care, peculiarly London type of good cheer. Whether the Merritts missed the fields and the cider and the skylarks, or whether they imagined that that ideal had ever truly been the world they had left, we shall never know. By the winter of 1871, George and Eliza had, as was typical of the inhabitants of the dingier quarters of Victorian London, a very substantial family. 6 children, ranging from Claire, at nearly 13, to Freddie, at 12 months. Mrs. Merritt was about to be confined with her 7th pregnancy. They were a poor family, as were most in Lambeth. George Merritt brought home 24 shillings a week, a miserable sum even then. With rent payable to the Archbishop, and with food needed for the 8 ever-open mouths, theirs were straitened circumstances indeed. On the Saturday morning, just before 2 a.m., Merritt was awakened by a neighbour tapping on his window, as prearranged. He rose from bed and readied himself for the dawn shift. It was a bitter morning, and he dressed as warmly as he could afford, a threadbare greatcoat over the kind of smock jacket that Victorians called a slop, a tattered grey shirt, corduroy trousers tied at the ankle with twine, heavy socks, and black boots. The clothes were none too clean, but he was to heave coal for the next 8 hours, and could not be too bothered with appearance. His wife recalled him striking a light before leaving home. Her last sight of him was under one of the bright gas lamps with which Lambeth streets had recently been equipped. His breath was visible in the cold night air, or maybe he was just puffing on his pipe, and he walked purposefully down to the end of Cornwall Road before turning into Belvedere Road. The night was clear and starlit, and once his footsteps had faded, soundless except for the clanking and puffing of the ever-present railway engines. Mrs. Merritt had no reason to be concerned, she assumed, as she had for each of the 20 previous nights on which her husband had worked the dawn shift, that all would be well. George was simply making his way as usual toward the high walls and ornate gates of the great brewery where he worked, shoveling coal beneath the shadow of the great Red Lion that was one of London's better-known landmarks. There may have been little money in the job, but working at so famous an institution as the Red Lion Brewery, well, that was some reason for pride. But that night George Merritt never reached his destination. As he passed the entrance to Tennyson Street, between where the south side of the Lambeth lead works abutted onto the north wall of the brewery, there came a sudden cry. A man shouted at him, appeared to be chasing him, was yelling furiously. Merritt was frightened. This was something more than a mere footpad. That silent and menacing figure who lurked in the dark, carrying a lead-tipped cosh and wearing a mask. This was something quite out of the ordinary, and Merritt began to run in terror, slipping and sliding on the frost-slick cobbles. He looked back. The man was still there, still chasing after him, still shouting angrily. Then, quite incredibly, he stopped and raised a gun, took aim, and fired. The shot missed, whistling past him and striking the brewery wall. George Merritt tried to run faster. He cried out for help. There was another shot, perhaps another, and then a final shot that struck the unfortunate Merritt in the neck. He fell heavily onto the cobbled pavement, his face down, a pool of blood spreading around him. Moments later came the running footfalls of Constable Burton, who found the man, lifted him, and attempted to comfort him. The other policeman, William Ward, summoned a passing hansom cab from the still busy thoroughfare of Waterloo Road. They gently picked the wounded man up from the ground, hoisted him into the vehicle, and ordered the driver to take them as fast as possible to St. Thomas's Hospital, 500 yards farther south on Belvedere Road, across from the Archbishop's London Palace. The horses did their best, their hooves striking sparks from the cobbles, as they rushed the victim to the emergency entrance. It was a futile journey. Doctors examined George Merritt and attempted to close the gaping wound in his neck, but his carotid artery had been severed, his spine snapped by 2 large-caliber bullets. The man who had perpetrated this unprecedented crime was, within moments of committing it, in the firm custody of Constable Tarrant. He was a tall, well-dressed man of what the policeman described as military appearance, with an erect bearing and a haughty air. He held a still-smoking revolver in his right hand. He made no attempt to run, but stood silently as the policeman approached. "Who is it that has fired?" asked the constable. "I did," said the man, holding up the gun. Tarrant snatched it from him. "Whom did you fire at?" he asked. The man pointed down Belvedere Road to the figure lying motionless beneath a street lamp just outside the brewery store. He made the only droll remark that history records him as having made, but a remark that, as it happens, betrayed one of the driving weaknesses of his life. "It was a man," he said with tone of disdain. "You do not suppose I would be so cowardly as to shoot a woman?" By now 2 other policemen had arrived on the scene, as had inquisitive locals, among them the Hungerford Bridge toll collector, who at first had not dared go out, for fear I'd take a bullet," and a woman undressing in her room on Tennyson Street, a street in which it was apparently far from uncommon for women to be undressing at all hours. Constable Tarrant, pointing toward the victim and ordering his two colleagues to see what they could do for him, and to prevent a crowd from gathering, escorted the supposed and unprotesting murderer to the Tower Street police station. On the way, his prisoner became rather more voluble, though Tarrant described him as cool, collected, and clearly not affected by drink. It had all been a terrible accident. He'd shot the wrong man, he insisted. He was after someone else, someone quite different. Someone had broken into his room. He was simply chasing him away, defending himself as anyone surely had a perfect right to do. "Don't handle me," he said when Tarrant put a hand on his shoulder. But then, rather more gently, he said to the policeman, "You have not searched me, you know." "I'll do that at the station," replied the constable. "How do you know I haven't got another gun and might shoot you?" The policeman, plodding and imperturbable, replied that if he did have another gun, perhaps he would be so kind as to keep it in his pocket for the time being. "But I do have a knife," replied the prisoner. "Keep that in your pocket also," said the stolid constable. There turned out to be no other gun, but a search did turn up a long hunting knife in a leather sheath, strapped to the man's belt behind his back. "A surgical instrument," it was explained. "I don't always carry it with me." Tarrant, once he completed the search, explained to the desk sergeant what had happened on Belvedere Road a few moments before. The pair then set about formally interviewing the arrested man. His name was William Chester Minor. He was 37 years old, and, as the policeman suspected from his bearing, a former army officer. He was also a qualified surgeon. He had lived in London for less than a year, and had taken rooms locally, living alone in a simple, furnished upstairs room nearby at 41 Tennyson Street. He evidently had no financial need to live so economically, for he was in fact a man of very considerable means. He hinted that he had come to this lubricious quarter of town for reasons other than the simply monetary, though what those reasons might be did not emerge in the early interrogations. By dawn he was taken off to the Horsemonger Lane jail, charged with murder. But there was one additional complication. William Minor, it turned out, came from New Haven, Connecticut. He had a commission in the U.S. Army. He was an American. This put a wholly new complexion on the case. The American legation had now to be told. And so in mid-morning, despite its being a Saturday, the Foreign Office formally notified the U.S. Minister in London that one of their army surgeons had been arrested and was being held on a charge of murder. The shooting on Belvedere Road, Lambeth, already because of its rarity a cause célèbre, had now become an international incident. The British papers, always eager to vent editorial spleen on their transatlantic rivals, made hay with this particular aspect of the story. "The light estimation in which human life is held by Americans," sniffed the South London press, "may be noted as one of the most significant points of difference between them and Englishmen, and this is a most shocking example of it brought to our own doors. The victim of a cruel mistake has left a wife, near confinement, and 7 children, the eldest only 13, to the mercy of the world. It is gratifying to be able to record that the benevolent are coming forward with alacrity to the succour of the widow and the fatherless, and it is most sincerely to be hoped that all who can spare even a trifle will do their best to help the victims of this dreadful tragedy. The American Vice-Consul General has, in the most thoughtful manner, opened a subscription list and issued an appeal to Americans now in London to do what they can to alleviate the misery which an act of their countryman's has entailed." Scotland Yard detectives were soon put onto the case. So important had it suddenly become that justice was seen to be done on both sides of the Atlantic. Since Minor, silent in his prison cell, was offering no help, except to say that he did not know the victim and had shot him in error, they began to investigate any possible motive. In doing so, they uncovered the beginnings of the trail of a remarkable and tragic life. William Minor had come to Britain the previous autumn because he was ill, suffering at least in part from an ailment some papers said was occasioned by the looseness of his private life. It was suggested by the lawyer later appointed to defend him that his motivation in coming to England was to quiet a mind that had become, as Victorian doctors were apt to say, inflamed. It was said that he had suffered a lesion on the brain, and many causes were put forward for it. He had, according to his lawyer, been in an asylum in the United States, and he had taken retirement from the army on the grounds of ill health. He had been described by those who met him as a gentleman of fine education and ability, but with eccentric and dissolute habits. He first settled at Radley's Hotel in the West End, and from there travelled by train to the major cities of Europe. He had brought with him a letter from a friend at Yale University, recommending him to John Ruskin, the celebrated British artist and critic. The two men had met once, and Minor had been encouraged to take his watercolours along with him on his travels, and to paint as a form of relaxation. As the police imagined, Minor had moved from the West End shortly after Christmas 1871, and settled in Lambeth, a highly dubious choice for a man of his background and breeding, unless, as he later admitted, it offered him easy access to easy women. The American authorities told Scotland Yard that they already had records of his behaviour as an army officer. He had a long history of frequenting what were then beginning to be called the Tenderloin districts of the cities in which he'd been posted, most notably New York, where he'd been assigned to Governor's Island, and from where, on his leave days, he had gone regularly to some of Manhattan's roughest bars and music halls. He had, it was said, a prodigious sexual appetite. He had caught venereal diseases at least once, and a medical examination conducted at Horsemonger Lane Jail showed that he had a case of gonorrhea even then. He had caught it, he said, from a local prostitute, and had tried to cure it by injecting white Rhine wine into his urethra. An almost amusingly inventive attempt at a remedy, and one that, not surprisingly, failed. His room, however, betrayed none of this seamier side. The detectives reported that they found his heavy leather and brass-bound portmanteaus, a great deal of money, mainly French, in 20-livre notes, a gold watch and chain, some Ely's bullets for his gun, his surgeon's commission, and his letter of appointment as a captain in the U.S. Army. There was also the letter of introduction to Ruskin, as well as a large number of watercolours, evidently by Minor himself. They were said by everyone who saw them to be of the highest quality. Views of London, largely, many from the hills above the Crystal Palace. His landlady, Mrs. Fisher, said that he'd been a perfectly good tenant, but odd. He used to go away for several days at a time, and on returning, rather ostentatiously left his hotel bills. Charing Cross Hotel was one, she remembered, the Crystal Palace Hotel another, lying around for all to see. He seemed, she said, a very anxious man. Often he demanded that the furniture in his room be moved. He also seemed afraid that people might break in. He had one particular worry, Mrs. Fisher told the police. Dr. Minor was apparently formidably afraid of the Irish. He would ask interminably whether or not she had any Irish servants working in the house, and if so, demand that they be sacked. Did she have Irish visitors, any Irish lodgers? He was always to be kept informed of a possibility that in Lambeth, which had a large population of casual Irish labourers working on the legions of London construction sites, was in fact all too real. Yet it was not until the murder trial, held in early April, that the full extent of Dr. Minor's illness became starkly apparent. Among the score of witnesses who appeared before the Lord Chief Justice in the court at Kingston Assizes, for this was Surrey's jurisdiction still, not London's, 3 of them told a stunned courtroom what they knew of the sad captain. The London police, for a start, admitted that they were already somewhat acquainted with him, and that for some time before the murder had known that they had a troubled man living in their midst. A Scotland Yard detective named Williamson testified that Miner had come to the yard 3 months earlier, complaining that men were coming to his rooms at night, trying to poison him. He thought that they were members of the Fenian Brotherhood, militant Irish nationalists, and they were bent on breaking into his lodgings, hiding in the roof rafters, slipping through the windows. He made such allegations several times, said Williamson. Shortly before Christmas, Miner had even persuaded the Commissioner of Police in New Haven to write a letter to the Yard, underlining the fears that Miner felt. Even after the doctor moved to Tennyson Street, he kept in touch with Williamson. On January the 12th, 1872, he wrote that he'd been drugged and was afraid that the Fenians were planning to murder him and make it look as though his death had been a suicide. A classic cry for help, one might think today. But an exasperated Superintendent Williamson did nothing and told no one, beyond noting with some contempt in his logbook that Miner was clearly, and this was the first use of the word to describe the hapless American, insane. Then came a witness who had something very curious to offer from his observations of Dr. Miner during the time the American was held on remand in the cells at Horsemonger Lane. The witness, whose name was William Dennis, was a member of a profession that has long since receded from modern memory. He was what was called a Bethlehem watcher. Usually he was employed at London's Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane, such a dreadful place that the name has given us the word Bedlam, where his duties included watching the prisoner patients through the night to make sure that they behaved themselves and did not try to cheat justice by committing suicide. He had been seconded to the Horsemonger Lane jail in mid-February, he said, to watch the nocturnal activities of the strange visitor. He had watched him, he testified, for 24 nights. It was a most curious and disturbing experience, Dennis told the jury. Each morning Dr. Miner would awake and immediately accuse him of having been paid by someone specifically to molest him while he slept. Then he would spit dozens of times, as though trying to remove something that had been put into his mouth. He would next leap from his bed and scrabble about underneath it, looking for people who, he insisted, had hidden there and were planning to annoy him. Dennis told his superior, the prison surgeon, that he was quite certain William Miner was mad. From the police interrogation notes came the evidence of an imagined motive for the crime, and with them a further indication of Dr. Miner's patent instability. Each night, Miner had told his questioners, unknown men, often lower class, often Irish, would come to his room while he was sleeping. They would maltreat him. They would violate him in ways he could not possibly describe. For months, ever since these nocturnal visitors had begun to torment him, he had taken to sleeping with his Colt service revolver, loaded with 5 cartridges, beneath his pillow. On the night in question he awoke with a start, certain that a man was standing in the shadows at the foot of his bed. He reached under the pillow for his gun. The man saw him and took to his heels, running down the stairs and out of the house. Miner followed him as fast as he could, saw a man running down into Belvedere Road, was certain that this was the intruder, shouted at him, then fired 4 times, until he'd hit him and the man lay still, unable to harm him further. The court listened in silence. The landlady shook her head. No one could get into her house at night without a key, she had said. The landlady shook her head. No one could get into her house at night without a key, she had said. Everyone slept very lightly. There could not have been an intruder. And as final confirmation, the court then heard from the prisoner's step-brother, George Miner. It had been a nightmare, said George, having brother William staying in the family house in New Haven. Every morning he would accuse people of trying to break into his room the night before, of trying to molest him. He was being persecuted. Evil men were trying to insert metallic biscuits coated with poison in his mouth. They were in league with others who hid in the attic, came down at night while he was asleep, and treated him foully. Everything was punishment, he said, for an act he'd been forced to commit while in the American army. Only by going to Europe, he said, could he escape his demons. He would travel and paint and live the life of a respected gentleman of art and culture, and the persecutors might melt away into the night. The court listened in melancholy silence while Dr. Miner sat in the dock, morose, shamed. The lawyer the American consul general had procured for him said only that it was clear that his client was insane, and that the jury should treat him as such. The Chief Justice nodded his agreement. It had been a brief but sorry case. The defendant an educated and cultured man, a foreigner and a patriot, a figure quite unlike the wretches who more customarily stood in the dock before him. But the law had to be applied with just precision, whatever the condition or estate of the defendant, and the decision in this affair was in a sense a foregone conclusion. For 30 years the law in such cases had been guided by what were known as the Macnaghten rules, named for the man who in 1843 shot dead Sir Robert Peel's secretary, and who was acquitted on the grounds that he was so mad he could not tell right from wrong. The rules, which judged criminal responsibility rather than guilt, were to be applied in this case, he told the jury. If they were convinced that the prisoner was of unsound mind, and had killed George Merritt while under some delusion of the kind that they had just heard about, then they must do as juries were wont to do in this extraordinarily lenient time in British justice. They were to find William Chester Minor not guilty on grounds of insanity, and leave the judge to apply such custodial sanction as he felt prudent and necessary. And that is what the jury did, without deliberation, late on the afternoon of April 6, 1872. They found Dr. Minor legally innocent of a murder that all, including him, knew that he had committed. The Lord Chief Justice then applied the only sentence that was available to him, a sentence still passed occasionally today, and that has a beguiling charm to its language, despite the swingeing awfulness of its connotations. "You will be detained in safe custody, Dr. Minor," said the judge, "until Her Majesty's pleasure be known." It was a decision that was to have unimaginable and wholly unanticipated implications, effects that echo and ripple through the English literary world to this day. The Home Department took brief note of the sentence, and made the further decision that Dr. Minor's detention, which, considering the severity of his illness, was likely to occupy the rest of his natural life, would have to be suffered in the newly built showpiece of the British penal system, a sprawling set of red brick buildings located behind high walls and spiked fences in the village of Crowthorne in the royal county of Berkshire. Dr. Minor was to be transported as soon as was convenient from his temporary prison in Surrey to the asylum for the criminally insane, Broadmoor. Dr. William C. Minor, Surgeon Captain, U.S. Army, a forlornly proud figure from one of the oldest and best-regarded families of New England, was henceforward to be formally designated in Britain by Broadmoor File Number 742, and to be held in permanent custody as a certified criminal lunatic. Chapter 2. The Man Who Taught Latin to Cattle. Polymath, also polymath. Adjective, Greek, polymathes, having learnt much. Feminine, pollu, much plus math. Stem of manthanine, to learn, so French, polymath. A person of much or varied learning, one acquainted with various subjects of study. 1621, Burton, Anat Mel Democre to Redeur, 1676, 4-2. To be thought and held polymathes and polyhistors. A. 1840, Moore, Devil Among Skull. 7. The polymaths and polyhistors, polyglots, and all their sisters. 1855, M. Patterson, S. 1-290. He belongs to the class which German writers have denominated polymaths. 1897, O. Smeaton, Smollett, 230. One of the last of the mighty Scots polymaths. Philology. In Chaucer, add Latin, philologia. In 17th century, probably A. French, philologie, add Latin, philologia, A. Greek, philologia, abstract from philologos, fond of speech. Talkative, fond of discussion or argument, studious of words, fond of learning and literature. Literary, from philo, philo plus logos, word, speech, etc. 1. Love of learning and literature, the study of literature in a wide sense, including grammar, literary criticism and interpretation, the relation of literature and written records to history, etc., literary or classical scholarship, polite learning. It took more than 70 years to create the 12 tombstone-sized volumes that made up the first edition of what was to become the great Oxford English Dictionary. This heroic, royally dedicated literary masterpiece, which was first called the New English Dictionary, but eventually became the Oxford Ditto, and thenceforward was known familiarly by its initials as the OED, was completed in 1928. Over the following years there were 5 supplements, and then, half a century later, a second edition that integrated the first and all the subsequent supplementary volumes into one new 20-volume whole. The book remains in all senses a truly monumental work, and with very little serious argument is still regarded as a paragon, the most definitive of all guides to the language that, for good or ill, has become the lingua franca of the civilized modern world. Just as English is a very large and complex language, so the OED is a very large and complex book. It defines well over 500,000 words. It contains scores of millions of characters, and at least in its early versions, many miles of hand-set type. Its enormous and enormously heavy volumes are bound in dark blue cloth. Printers and designers and bookbinders worldwide see it as an apotheosis of their art, a handsome and elegant creation that looks and feels more than amply suited to its lexical thoroughness and accuracy. The OED's guiding principle, the one that has set it apart from most other dictionaries, is its rigorous dependence on gathering quotations from published or otherwise recorded uses of English, and using them to illustrate the use of the sense of every single word in the language. The reason behind this unusual and tremendously labor-intensive style of editing and compiling was both bold and simple. By gathering and publishing selected quotations, the dictionary could demonstrate the full range of characteristics of each and every word with a very great degree of precision. Quotations could show exactly how a word has been employed over the centuries, how it has undergone subtle changes of shades of meaning, or spelling, or pronunciation, and perhaps most important of all, how and more exactly when each word slipped into the language in the first place. No other means of dictionary compilation could do such a thing. Only by finding and showing examples could the full range of a word's past possibilities be explored. The aims of those who began the project back in the 1850s were bold and laudable, but there were distinct commercial disadvantages to their methods. It took an immense amount of time to construct a dictionary on this basis. It was too time-consuming to keep up with the evolution of the language it sought to catalogue. The work that finally resulted was uncommonly vast and needed to be kept updated with almost equally vast additions. And it remains to this day, for all of these reasons, a hugely expensive book, both to produce and to buy. But, withal, it is widely accepted that the OED has a value far beyond its price. It remains in print, and it still sells well. It is the unrivaled cornerstone of any good library, an essential work for any reference collection, and it is still cited as a matter of course. The OED says, in parliaments, courtrooms, schools, and lecture halls in every corner of the English-speaking world, and probably in countless others beyond. It wears its status with a magisterial self-assurance, not least by giving its 500,000 definitions a robustly Victorian certitude of tone. Some call the language of the dictionary old-fashioned, high-flown, even arrogant. Note well, they say by way of example, how infuriatingly prissy the compilers remain when dealing with even so modest an oath as bloody. Though the modern editors place the original NED definition between quotation marks, it is a word now constantly in the mouths of the lowest classes, but by respectable people considered a horrid word, on a par with obscene or profane language, and usually printed in the newspapers, in police reports, etc., B-blank-Y. Even the modern definition is too lamely self-regarding for most. There is no ground for the notion, the entry reassures us, that bloody, offensive as from associations it now is to ears polite, contains any profane allusion. It is those with ears polite, one supposes, who see in the dictionary something quite different. They worship it as a last bastion of cultured Englishness, a final echo of value from the greatest of all modern empires. But even they will admit of a number of amusing eccentricities about the book, both in its selections and in the editor's choice of spellings. A small but veritable academic industry has recently developed, in which modern scholars grumble about what they see as the sexism and racism of the work, its fussily and outdated imperial attitude. And to Oxford's undying shame there is even one word, though only one, that all admit was actually lost during the 7 decades of the OED's preparation, though the word was added in a supplement 5 years after the first edition appeared. There are many such critics, and with the book being such a large and immobile target, there will no doubt be many more. And yet most of those who come to use it, no matter how doctrinally critical they may be of its shortcomings, seem duly and inevitably in the end to admire it as a work of literature, as well as to marvel at its lexicographical scholarship. It is a book that inspires real and lasting affection. It is an awe-inspiring work, the most important reference book ever made, and given the unending importance of the English language, probably the most important that is ever likely to be. The story that follows can fairly be said to have 2 protagonists. One of them is Dr. Minor, the murdering soldier from the United States, and there is one other. To say that a story has 2 protagonists, or 3, or 10, is a perfectly acceptable, unremarkable modern form of speech. It happens, however, that a furious lexicographical controversy once raged over the use of the word, a dispute that helps illustrate the singular and peculiar way in which the Oxford English Dictionary has been constructed, and how, when it flexes its muscles, it has a witheringly intimidating authority. The word protagonist itself, when used in its general sense of meaning the leading figure in the plot of a story, or in a competition, or as the champion of some cause, is common enough. It is, as might be expected of a familiar word, defined fully and properly in the dictionary's first edition of 1928. The entry begins with the customary headings that show its spelling, its pronunciation, and its etymology. It comes from the Greek protos, meaning first, and agonistes, meaning actor, or literally the leading character to appear in a drama. Following this comes a distinguishing additional feature of the OED, the editor's selection of a string of 6 supporting quotations, which is about the average number for any one OED word, though some merit many more. The editors have divided the quotations under 2 headings. The first heading, with 3 sources quoted, shows how the word has been used to mean literally the chief personage in a drama. The next 3 quotations demonstrate a subtle difference, in which the word means the leading personage in any contest, or a prominent supporter of any cause. By general consent, this second meaning is the more modern. The first is the older, and now somewhat archaic version. The oldest quotation used to illustrate the first of these 2 meanings was that tracked down by the dictionary's lexical detectives from the writings of John Dryden in 1671. "'Tis charged upon me,' the quotation reads, 'that I make debauched persons my protagonists, or the chief persons of the drama.' This, from a lexicographical point of view, seems to be the English word's mother lode, a fair clue that the word may well have been introduced into the written language in that year, and possibly not before. But the OED offers no guarantee, German scholars in particular constantly deriving much pleasure from winning an informal lexicographic contest that aims at finding quotations that antedate those in the OED. At last count, the Germans alone had found 35,000 instances in which the OED quotation was not the first. Others, less stridently, chalk up their own small triumphs of lexical sleuthing, all of which Oxford's editors accept with disdainful equanimity, professing neither infallibility nor monopoly. This single quotation for protagonist is peculiarly neat, moreover, in that Dryden explicitly states the newly minted word's meaning within the sentence. So, from the dictionary editor's point of view, there is a double benefit of having the word's origin dated and its meaning explained, and both by a single English author. Finding and publishing quotations of usage is an imperfect way of making pronouncement about origins and meanings, of course, but to 19th century lexicographers it was the best method that had yet been devised, and it has not yet been bettered. From time to time experts succeed in challenging specific findings like this, and on occasions the dictionary is forced to recant, is obliged to accept a new and earlier quotation, and give to a particular word a longer history than the Oxford editors first allowed. Happily, protagonist itself has not so far been successfully challenged on chronological grounds. So far as the OED is concerned, 1671 still stands. The word has for 300-odd years been a member of that giant corpus known as the English vocabulary. The word appears again, and with a new supporting quotation, in the 1933 supplement, a volume that had to be added because of the sheer weight of new words and new evidence of new meanings that had accumulated during the decades when the original dictionary was being compiled. By now another shade of meaning had been found for it, that of a leading player in some game or sport. A sentence supporting this, from a 1908 issue of the Complete Lawn Tennis Player, is produced in evidence. But then comes the controversy, the other great book on the English language, Henry Fowler's hugely popular Modern English Usage, which was first published in 1926, insisted, contrary to what Dryden had been quoted as saying in the OED, that protagonist is a word that can only ever be used in the singular. Any use suggesting the contrary would be grammatically utterly wrong, and not just wrong, Fowler declares, but absurd. It would be nonsense to suggest that there could ever be two characters in a play, both of whom could be described as the most important. One either is the most important person or one is not. It took more than half a century before the OED decided to settle the matter. The 1981 supplement, in the classically magisterial way of the dictionary, tries to counter the excitable, and now, as it happens, late Mr. Fowler. It offers a new quotation, reinforcing the view that the word can be used plurally or singularly as the need arises. George Bernard Shaw, it says, wrote in 1950, "Living actors have to learn that they too must be invisible while the protagonists are conversing, and therefore must not move a muscle nor change their expression." Perhaps Fowler's great linguistic authority was technically correct, but the dictionary explains in an expanded version of its 1928 definition, perhaps only in the specific terms of classical Greek theatre, for which the word was first devised. In the common-sense world of modern English, the world that, after all, the great dictionary was designed to reify and define, to fix, in dictionary speak, it is surely quite reasonable to have two or more leading players in any story. Many dramas have room for more than one hero, and both or all may be equally heroic. If the ancient Greeks were one-hero dramatists, then so be it. In the rest of the world there could be as many as the dramatists cared to write parts for. Now there is a 20-volume second edition of the dictionary, with all the material from the supplements fully integrated with the original work, and new words and forms that have emerged in the years since, inserted as needs be. In that edition, protagonist appears in what is currently considered to be its true fixity, with 3 main meanings and 19 supporting quotations. Dryden's remains unaltered, the first appearance of the word, and in the plural, and to give even greater weight to the notion that the plural is a perfectly acceptable form, both the Times and the thriller writer and medievalist Dorothy L. Sayers are quoted in addition to Shaw. The word is thus now properly lexically set for all time, and is stated by the almost unchallengeable authority of the OED to be available for use in either the singular or the multiple, which happens to be just as well, considering, and to reiterate the point, the existence of 2 protagonists in this story. The first one, as is already clear, is Dr. William Chester Minor, the admitted and insane American murderer. The other is a man whose lifetime was more or less coincident with Minor's, but it was different in almost all its other respects. His name was James Augustus Henry Murray. The lives of the 2 men were over the years to become inextricably and most curiously entwined, and, moreover, both were to be entwined with the Oxford English Dictionary. Since the second of the 2 men, James Murray, was to become for the last 40 years of his life its greatest and most justly famous editor. James Murray was born in February 1837, the eldest son of a tailor and linen draper, in Howick, a pretty little market town in the valley of the Teviot River in the Scottish borders, and that was about all that he really wished the world to know about himself. "I am a nobody," he would write toward the end of the century, when fame had begun to creep up on him. "Treat me as a solar myth, or an echo, or an irrational quantity, or ignore me altogether." But it has long since proved impossible to ignore him, as he was to become a towering figure in British scholarship. Honours were showered on him during his lifetime, and he has achieved the standing of a mythic hero since his death. Murray's childhood alone, which was uncovered 20 years ago by his granddaughter Elizabeth, who opened his trunk of papers, hints temptingly that he was destined, despite his unpromising, unmoneyed, unsophisticated beginnings, for extraordinary things. He was a precocious, very serious little boy. He turned steadily into an astonishingly learned teenager, tall, well-built, with long hair and an early, bright red beard that added to his grave and forbidding appearance. "Knowledge is power," he declared on the fly-leaf of his school exercise book, and added, for as well as having a working knowledge by the time he was 15 of French, Italian, German, and Greek, he, like all educated children then, knew Latin. "Nihil est melius quam vita diligentissima." Nothing is better than a most diligent life. He had a voracious appetite, indeed an impassioned thirst, for all kinds of learning. He taught himself about the local geology and botany. He found a globe from which he could learn geography and foster a love for maps. He unearthed scores of textbooks from which he could take on the enormous burden of history. He observed and took pains to remember all the natural phenomena about him. His younger brothers would tell how he once awakened them late one night to show them the rising of Sirius the dog star, whose orbit and appearance over the horizon he had calculated, and that proved, to the family's sleepy exultation, to be perfectly correct. He particularly cherished encountering and interrogating people he met, who proved to be living links with history. He once found an ancient who had known someone who was present when Parliament proclaimed William and Mary joint sovereigns in 1689. Then again his mother would recount over and over how she had heard tell of the victory at Waterloo. And when he had children himself, he would allow them to be dandled on the knees of an elderly naval officer who was present when Napoleon agreed to surrender. He left school at 14, as did most of the poorer children of the British Isles. There was no money for him to go on to the fee-paying grammar school in nearby Melrose, and in any case his parents enjoyed some confidence in the lad's ability to teach himself, by pursuing, as he had vowed, the vita diligentissima. Their hopes proved well-founded. James continued to amass more and more knowledge, if only, as he would admit, for the sake of knowledge itself, and often in the most eccentric of ways. He engaged in furious digs at a multitude of archaeological sites all over the borders, which, being close to Hadrian's Wall, was a treasure trove of buried antiquities. He made attempts to teach the local cows to respond to calls in Latin. He would read out loud by the light of a minute oil lamp the works of a Frenchman with the grand name of Théodore Agrippa d'Aubigné, and translating for his family, who gathered about him, fascinated. Once, trying to invent water wings made from bundles of pond iris, he tied them to his arms, but he was turned upside down by more buoyancy than he calculated, and would have drowned. He was a non-swimmer, had not his friends rescued him by pulling him from the lake with his 5-foot-long bow tie. He memorized hundreds of phrases in Romany, the language of the passing gypsies. He learned bookbinding. He taught himself to embellish his own writings with elegant little drawings, flourishes, and curlicues, rather like the monkish illuminators of the Middle Ages. By 17, this argumentative, earnest, naive young Scot was employed in his hometown as an assistant headmaster, eagerly passing on the knowledge that he had so keenly amassed. By 20, he was a full-fledged headmaster of the local subscription academy. Ages 10 to 16, fees 1 guinea a term. And with his brother Alexander he became a leading member of that most Victorian and Scottish of bodies, the Howick branch of the Mutual Improvement Institute. He gave his first lecture, reading its pleasures and advantages, and went on to present learned papers to the town's literary and philosophical society on his new passion of phonetics, on the origins of the pronunciation and the foundations of the Scottish tongue, and, once he had discovered its delights, on the magic of Anglo-Saxon. And yet all this early promise seemed suddenly doomed, first by the onset of love, and then by the upset of tragedy. For in 1861, when he was just 24, James met, and the following year married, a handsome but delicate infant school music teacher named Maggie Scott. Their wedding picture shows James a strangely tall, vaguely simian figure in his ill-fitting frock coat and baggy trousers, a man with hugely long, knee-brushing arms, an unkempt beard, hair already thinning near the peak, eyes narrow and intense, neither happy nor unhappy, but full of thought, his mind seemingly filled with a kind of distracted foreboding. 2 years later they had a baby girl they christened Anna, but, as was wretchedly commonplace at the time, she died in infancy. Maggie Murray herself then fell gravely ill with consumption, and was said by the Howick doctors to be unlikely to withstand the rigours of another long Scottish winter. The recommended treatment was to sojourn in the south of France, but that, given James's tiny schoolmastering wage, was quite out of the question. Instead, the forlorn couple took off for London and modest lodgings in Peckham. James Murray, now 27, had, to his bitter disappointment, been forced by his domestic circumstances to abandon all his current intellectual pursuits, all his digging and delving and his pronouncements on linguistics, phonetics, and the origins of words, on which topic he was then enjoying a lively correspondence with a notable scholar, Alexander Melville Bell, father of the infinitely more famous Alexander Graham Bell. Economic necessity and marital duty, though he was devoted to Maggie and never complained, had pressed him to become instead, and with a dreary predictability, a clerk in a London bank. With his employment, in starched cuffs and green eye-shade, perched on a high stool at the back of the head office of the Chartered Bank of India, it seemed as though the story might have come to an ignominious end. Not so. Within just a matter of months, he was back in the traces. He had renewed his eccentric pursuit of learning, studying Hindustani and Achaemenid Persian on his daily commute, trying to determine by their accents from which region of Scotland various London policemen came, lecturing on the body and its architecture before the Camberwell Congregational Church, where, as a confirmed and lifelong teetotaler, he was a keen member of the Temperance League, and even noting with amused detachment, while his still sickly and well-loved Maggie was dying, that in her nightly delirium she lapsed into the broad Scots dialect of her childhood, abandoning the more refined tones of a schoolteacher. That small discovery, that marginal addition to his learning, went some way to helping him through the misery of her subsequent death. A year later, James was engaged to another young woman, and a year later still, married. While he had clearly loved and admired Maggie Scott, it was soon abundantly clear that in Ada Ruthven, whose father worked for the great Indian Peninsula Railway, and was an admirer of Alexander von Humboldt, and whose mother claimed to have been at school with Charlotte Bronte, here was a woman who was far more his social and intellectual equal. They were to remain devoted, and to have 11 children together, the first 9, according to the wishes of James' father-in-law, bearing the middle name Ruthven. A letter that James Murray wrote in 1867, his 30th year, applying for a position with the British Museum, offers some of the flavour of his barely believable range of knowledge, as well as his unabashed candour in telling people about it. I have to state that philology, both comparative and special, has been my favourite pursuit during the whole of my life, and that I possess a general acquaintance with the languages and literature of the Aryan and Syro-Arabic classes, not indeed to say that I am familiar with all or nearly all of these, but that I possess that general lexical and structural knowledge which makes the intimate knowledge only a matter of a little application. With several I have a more intimate acquaintance, as with the Romance tongues, Italian, French, Catalan, Spanish, Latin, and in a less degree Portuguese, Vaudois, Provençal, and various dialects. In the Teutonic branch I am tolerably familiar with Dutch, having at my place of business correspondence to read in Dutch, German, French, and occasionally other languages, Flemish, German, Danish. In Anglo-Saxon and Moiso-Gothic my studies have been much closer, I having prepared some works for publication upon these languages. I know a little of the Celtic, and am at present engaged with the Slavonic, having obtained a useful knowledge of the Russian. In the Persian, Achaemenian, cuneiform, and Sanskrit branches, I know for the purposes of comparative philology. I have sufficient knowledge of Hebrew and Syriac to read at sight the Old Testament and Peshito. To a less degree I know Aramaic, Arabic, Coptic, and Phoenician to the point where it was left by Genesius. It somewhat beggars belief that the museum turned his job application down. Murray was initially crushed, but soon recovered. Before long he was consoling himself in a characteristic way, by comparing, in lexical terms, the sheep-counting numerology of the Wowanock Indians of Maine with that of the moorland farmers of Yorkshire. Murray's interest in philology might have remained that of an enthusiastic amateur, had it not been for his friendship with 2 men. One was a Trinity College, Cambridge mathematician named Alexander Ellis, and the other a notoriously pig-headed, colossally rude phonetician named Henry Sweet, the figure on whom Bernard Shaw would later base his character Professor Henry Higgins in Pygmalion, which was transmuted later into the eternally popular My Fair Lady, in which Higgins was played in the film by the similarly rude and pig-headed actor Rex Harrison. These men swiftly turned the amateur dabbler and dilettante into a serious philological scholar. Murray was introduced into membership of the august and exclusive Philological Society. No mean achievement for a young man who, it must be recalled, had left school at 14 and had not thus far attended a university. By 1869 he was on the Society's council. In 1873, having left the bank and gone back to teaching at Mill Hill School, he published The Dialect of the Southern Counties of Scotland. It was a work that was to gild and solidify his reputation to the point of wide admiration, and to win him the invitation to contribute an essay on the history of the English language for the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. It also brought him into contact with one of the most amazing men of Victorian England, the half-mad scholar gypsy, who was secretary of the Philological Society, Frederick Furnivall. Some thought Furnivall, despite his devotion to mathematics, Middle English, and philology, a total clown, an ass, a scandalous dandy, and a fool. His critics, who were legion, made much of the fact that his father maintained a private lunatic asylum in the house where the young Frederick had grown up. He was a socialist, an agnostic, and a vegetarian, and to alcohol and tobacco he was a stranger all his life. He was a keen athlete, obsessed by sculling, and was particularly fond of teaching handsome young waitresses, recruited from the ABC tea shop in New Oxford Street, the best way to get the most speed out of a slender racing boat he had designed. A photograph of him survives from 1901. He wears an impish smirk, not least because he's surrounded by 8 pretty members of the Hammersmith Sculling Club for Girls, content and well-exercised women, whose skirts may be long, but whose shirts lie snug on their ample breasts. In the background stands a stern Victorian matron, clad all in tough serge weeds, scowling. Frederick Furnivall was indeed an appalling flirt. He was condemned by many as socially reprehensible for committing the doubly unpardonable sin of marrying a lady's maid, and then abandoning her. Dozens of editors and publishers refused to work with him. He was devoid of tact or discretion, had a boyish frankness of speech which offended many, and led him into unedifying controversies. His declarations of hostility to religion and to class distinctions were often unreasonable and gave pain. But he was a brilliant scholar, and like James Murray he had an obsessive thirst for learning. Among his friends and admirers he could count Alfred Lord Tennyson, Charles Kingsley, William Morris, John Ruskin, Dr. Miner's London mentor, it would later turn out, and the Yorkshire-born composer Frederick Delius. Kenneth Graham, a fellow scholar who worked at the Bank of England, came duly under Furnivall's spell, wrote The Wind in the Willows, and painted Furnivall into the plot as the water rat. "We learned 'em," says Toad. "We taught 'em," corrects Rat. Furnivall may have been a cunning mischief-maker, but he was also often right. He may have been Graham's mentor, but he was a much more significant figure in James Murray's life. As the latter's biographer was to say admiringly, Furnivall was to Murray stimulating and persuasive, often meddlesome and exasperating, always a dynamic and powerful influence, eclipsing even James in his gusto for life. He was in many ways a Victorian's Victorian, an Englishman's Englishman, and a natural choice, as the country's leading philologist, to take a dominant role in the making of the great new dictionary that was then in the process of being constructed. It was Furnivall's friendship with and sponsorship of James Murray, as well as Murray's links with Sweet and Ellis, that were to lead ultimately to the most satisfactory event of all. This occurred on the afternoon of April 26, 1878, at which time James Augustus Henry Murray was invited to Oxford, to a room in Christ Church College, Oxford, and to an awesome full meeting of the grandest minds in the land, the delegates of the Oxford University Press. They were a formidable group. The college dean, Henry Liddell, whose daughter Alice had so captivated the Christ Church mathematician Charles Ludwig Dodgson that he wrote an adventure book for her set in Wonderland. Max Müller, the Leipzig philologist, Orientalist, and Sanskrit scholar, who now held Oxford's chair of comparative philology. The Regius Professor of History, William Stubbs, the man who was credited in Victorian times with having made the subject worthy of respectable academic pursuit. The Canon of Christ Church and classical scholar Edwin Palmer, the Warden of New College, James Sewell, and so on and so on. High church, high learning, high ambition. These were the men who counted, the architects of the great intellectual constructions that originated during England's haughtiest and most self-confident time. As Isambard Kingdom Brunel was to bridges and railways, as Sir Richard Burton was to Africa, and as Robert Falcon Scott was soon to be to the Antarctic, so these men were the best, the makers of indelible monuments to learning, of the books that were to be the core foundation of the great libraries all around the globe. And they had a project, they said, in which Dr. Murray might well be very interested indeed. A project that, unwittingly on the parts of all concerned, was eventually to put James Murray on a collision course with a man whose interests and whose piety were curiously congruent with his own. At first blush, William Minor might seem to have been a man more marked by his differences from Murray than by such similarities as these. He was rich, where Murray was poor. He was of high estate, where Murray's condition was irredeemably, if respectably, low. And though he was almost the same age, just 3 years separated them, he had been born both of a different citizenship, and, as it happens, in a place that was almost as many thousands of miles away from Murray's British Isles, as it was then thought prudent and practicable for ordinary people to reach. Chapter 3. The Madness of War. Lunatic. A. Ad late, Latin lunaticus, from Latin luna, moon. See Attic. Compare French lunatique, Spanish, Italian, lunatico. A. Adjective. 1. Originally affected with the kind of insanity that was supposed to have recurring periods dependent on the changes of the moon. In modern use, synonymous with insane. Current in popular and legal language, but not now employed technically by physicians. Ceylon, the lushly overgrown tropical island that seems to hang from India's southern tip like a teardrop, or a pear, or a pearl, or even, some say, a Virginia ham, is regarded by priests of the world's stricter religions as the place to which Adam and Eve were exiled after their fall from grace. It is a Garden of Eden for sinners, an island limbo for those who yielded to temptation. These days it is called Sri Lanka. Once the Arab sea traders called it Serendib, and in the 18th century Horace Walpole created a fanciful story about 3 princes who reigned there, and who had the enchanting habit of stumbling across wonderful things quite by chance. Thus was the English language enriched by the word serendipity, without its inventor, who never travelled to the East, ever really knowing why. But as it happens, Walpole was more accurate than he could ever have known. Ceylon is in reality a kind of post-lapsarian treasure island, where every sensual gift of the tropics is available, both to reward temptation and to beguile and charm. So, there are cinnamon and coconut, coffee and tea. There are sapphires and rubies, mangoes and cashews, elephants and leopards, and everywhere a rich, hot, sweetly moist breeze, scented by the sea, spices and blossoms.